On February the 20th, 1969, the prosecution rested its case in the matter of the State of Louisiana versus Clay L. Shaw. Jim Garrison and his deputies had spent the past 2 weeks presenting evidence about shadowy meetings between Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald and shadowy gunmen standing on the grassy knoll, but the prosecution's case had been notably lacking in hard, non-shadowy proof of Shaw's guilt. When the prosecution rested, Shaw's lawyer, Irvin Diamond, filed an immediate motion for a directed verdict of not guilty, which meant that he was asking the judge, Edward Haggerty, to instruct the jury to find the defendant not guilty straight away on the grounds that the state had failed to make even a prima facie case against him. This would be an extraordinary ruling for Judge Haggerty to make if he made it. It would mean that Clay Shaw could walk free immediately without the defence having to call any witnesses of its own. Judge Haggerty agreed to hear arguments for and against this motion, and he sent the jury out of the courtroom while those arguments were made. Irvin Diamond argued for the defence that the state's whole case had been an absolute void. They'd failed to prove that any conspiracy to murder the president had taken place, let alone a conspiracy involving Clay Shaw. To prove his point, Diamond quoted some damning lines from the testimony of Perry Russo, the man who was supposed to have been Garrison's star witness against Shaw. Garrison's whole case had been premised right from the start on Perry Russo's claim that one night in the summer of 1963, in the apartment of David Ferry, Russo had witnessed Shaw, Ferry and Oswald discussing the president's murder. But on the witness stand, under cross-examination, Russo had explicitly denied that the conversation he claimed to have witnessed amounted to a conspiracy. "I never said anything about a conspiracy," Russo testified. "I didn't sit in on any conspiracy." Russo had also been asked on cross-examination if he had heard the three men agree to do anything, and he had replied no. And as Irvin Diamond put it to Judge Haggerty, without an agreement to do anything, you do not have a conspiracy. Diamond also quoted Russo's admission under cross-examination that the meeting he had supposedly witnessed might well have been nothing more than a, quote, bull session. And as Diamond put it to the judge, at a time when Kennedy was unpopular, there were many loose bull sessions and remarks made by many who disagreed with his policies. It would be ludicrous to claim that these constituted a conspiracy. Most observers agreed that the prosecution's case had been underwhelming, but the question that Judge Haggerty now had to consider was whether the case had been so underwhelming that he should throw it out of court. The judge didn't rule on that question immediately. He said that he intended to read over the testimony of Perry Russo that night and come back with a decision the next morning. When everybody came back into court the next morning, there was tension in the courtroom. Most of the reporters present believed that Judge Haggerty was about to throw the case out, but he didn't. He denied the defence's motion, and he ruled that the trial would go on, and the defence would now have to present its case. At the time, this seemed like a defeat for Clay Shaw and his team, but in the long run, we're lucky that Judge Haggerty ruled the way he did, because if he'd thrown the case out of court, we would still be hearing from conspiracy theorists today that the deep state shut down the trial of Clay Shaw before all of Jim Garrison's sizzling revelations could be pondered by the jury. The defence case at the trial would turn out to be relatively brief. The state's case had run for 2 weeks, but the defence case ran for just 1. The first witness called by the defence was Marina Oswald, who was now remarried and went by the name Marina Oswald Porter. Marina testified that Lee Harvey Oswald had never grown a beard, which meant that he had never looked anything like the scruffy, bearded roommate of David Ferry, who had been mentioned in the testimony of Perry Russo. Marina also testified that during the whole 6-month period in 1963, when she and Oswald had lived in New Orleans, there was only one night when Oswald had ever been away from their apartment, and that was the night in August when he was arrested and put in jail after he scuffled on the street with members of the local anti-Castro community. If that was the only night that Oswald had been away from their apartment, then that blew up all of the prosecution's fanciful stories about how Oswald had spent many a night during that period attending super gay conspiracy parties hosted by David Ferrie and Clay Shaw. The defence also called James Phelan, the Saturday Evening Post reporter who had discovered back in May 1967 that Perry Russo's story had undergone a radical change when he was hypnotised by Garrison's office. Before being hypnotised, Russo had never even claimed to have met either Oswald or Shaw, but after being hypnotised, he suddenly remembered that he'd not only met them, he had heard them discussing the murder of the President of the United States. Then the defence called Dean Andrews, the tubby, flamboyant, shade-wearing New Orleans attorney who was played by John Candy in the JFK movie. Before we talk about the remarkable admissions that Dean Andrews made on the stand, we probably should pause to remind ourselves of who he was. Even more than Perry Russo, Dean Andrews was the man whose tall stories about the Kennedy assassination had gotten Clay Shaw into this whole mess in the first place. Andrews had started telling his tall stories about the assassination straight away, just a day after Kennedy's death. At the time, Andrews was lying in a hospital bed in New Orleans. He had pneumonia and he was heavily medicated. And in that state, he started telling people that a mysterious man named Bertrand had telephoned him in his hospital room the day after the assassination and had asked him to go to Dallas to act as Lee Harvey Oswald's attorney. This was a complete fantasy, but Andrews was so high at the time that it's possible that he did at some level honestly believe that this phone call had happened. At any rate, he didn't just tell this story to his friends. He also picked up the phone and rang up the FBI and the Secret Service, and he told the story to them. That turned out to be a big mistake, because naturally the FBI pressed Andrews for more details about his story. When they pressed him for more details about the mysterious Bertrand, Andrews told them that he believed that Bertrand was gay, and when they pressed him for Bertrand's first name, Andrews randomly came up with the name Clay. The FBI worked out pretty quickly that there was no real person in New Orleans named Clay Bertrand, but that random choice of first name from Andrews would end up having terrible consequences for Clay Shaw, because in the smithy of Jim Garrison's imagination, the name Clay was the smoking gun that brought Clay Shaw into the case. Garrison knew that Clay Shaw was gay, just like this person who went around calling himself Bertrand, and, according to Garrison, gay people only ever changed their last name when using an alias, but always kept their first name. Hence, Clay Shaw had to be Clay Bertrand. When Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw in March 1967, he had high hopes that Dean Andrews would become the star witness in his case against Shaw, but Andrews had refused to play ball. He'd refused to testify against Shaw at the preliminary hearing. Garrison had retaliated by charging Andrews with multiple counts of perjury. In August 1967, Andrews had been convicted on several of those charges, and his legal career had effectively been destroyed. He had appealed that verdict, and when he testified for the defence at the Shaw trial, his appeal still hadn't been heard. But even so, Andrews still had the integrity to get on the stand and testify for the defence and fix some of the damage that he'd done to Clay Shaw by finally telling the whole truth, even though the truth made him look like a pathetic clown. Andrews told the court, quote, "Under sedation, I elected a course that I have never been able to get away from. I started it and it has been whiplashing ever since, and I can't stop it. I got hooked with it. I elected to stick with it, and here I sit." The sorry truth, as Andrews had now admitted, was that nobody at all had rung him up in his hospital bed to ask him to represent Lee Harvey Oswald. He'd made the story up to get attention. "I would like to be famous too, other than as a perjurer," he testified. There was some scattered laughter in the courtroom when he said that, but Clay Shaw was not among the people who laughed. And you can't blame him, given that it was Andrews' clowning that had started this whole farce in the first place. Under cross-examination, Andrews testified that he'd tried to tell Jim Garrison time and again that Clay Shaw was not Clay Bertrand, but Garrison had simply refused to listen. "Clay Bertrand is a figment of my imagination," Andrews told the court. "If I had my life to live over again, I would say his name was John Jones." Judge Haggerty was apparently quite shaken by this part of Dean Andrews' testimony. The idea that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand and had frequently gone around using that alias was the cornerstone of the prosecution's whole case. And now Dean Andrews, the man who had put Clay Bertrand on the map in the first place, was admitting under oath that he had simply made the name up. Not only that, he'd made the whole man up. There never was and never had been a man in New Orleans who went around calling himself Clay Bertrand. If that was true, the foundation of Garrison's whole case against Clay Shaw had just disappeared. His whole case was imaginary. It was all based on the admitted lies of a heavily medicated fabulist. Judge Haggerty was so troubled by what Dean Andrews had just said that he called a 5-minute recess and he brought both sets of attorneys into his chambers. Exactly what was said during this meeting will probably never be officially confirmed, but according to one witness, Judge Haggerty told James Alcock and the other prosecuting attorneys that in light of what Dean Andrews had just said, they might like to, quote, reassess their position in this case. In other words, Haggerty was suggesting that it might now be time for the DA's office to do the decent thing and call the prosecution off. But Garrison's deputies were not prepared to do that. They told the judge that in Garrison's absence they, quote, lacked the authority to withdraw the case. So both sides returned to the courtroom and the trial went on. As the final defence witness, Irvin Diamond called Clay Shaw himself to the stand. Under questioning from Diamond, Shaw didn't say anything all that surprising or unexpected. He testified that he had never met David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, Dean Andrews or Charles Speisel, and until this whole thing began, he'd never clapped eyes on either Perry Russo or Vernon Bundy. He had never used the alias Clay Bertrand or Clem Bertrand. He'd never had anything against Jack Kennedy. In fact, he quite liked him and he'd voted for him, and he certainly had never conspired with anybody else to murder him. That was all true, and none of it was very surprising. But what was surprising was what happened next, when it was the prosecution's turn to cross-examine Clay Shaw. The first surprise, which I mentioned briefly in the previous episode, was that Jim Garrison didn't turn up in court to handle Shaw's cross-examination himself. Instead, he again left the job to his deputy James Alcock. That was a stunning move on Garrison's part. It's hard to overstate just how cowardly and shameful and hypocritical he was being. Garrison had spent the last 2 years bloviating about this vast conspiracy that he'd discovered and making big, confident promises about how he was going to blow the lid off the whole thing when he was finally allowed to bring the case to trial. He had destroyed Clay Shaw's reputation and he'd charged him with an appallingly serious crime. And now the trial was finally happening, and Shaw had volunteered to put himself on the witness stand, and he was now sitting there under oath, ready to answer all the accusations that the prosecution had to throw at him, and suddenly Jim Garrison found that he had better things to do than cross-examine Shaw himself. In fact, Garrison didn't even bother to turn up in court to hear Shaw's testimony. The next big surprise about Shaw's cross-examination was the way that Garrison's deputy James Alcock handled the job. Alcock's cross-examination of Shaw was incredibly brief and perfunctory. Vincent Bugliosi, in his book Reclaiming History, writes that one would automatically expect the cross-examination of someone accused of conspiring to murder the President of the United States to go on for several days and take up hundreds of pages of transcript. Bugliosi was in a good position to know that because before writing his book, he'd worked as a prosecutor and a deputy district attorney himself. But instead of taking up hundreds of pages of transcript, Alcock's cross-examination of Shaw took up only 50. And instead of lasting for days, Shaw's entire appearance on the witness stand, that is both his examination and his cross-examination, was all over in the space of one morning. And the way that James Alcock handled the cross-examination was also quite baffling. His tone was so unaggressive that it was almost friendly. As Bugliosi puts it, it couldn't possibly have been more soft and civil, so much so that it could have been Shaw's own lawyer asking the questions. In fact, Alcock's cross-examination of Shaw was so ineffective and softball that when it was over, Irvin Diamond just stood up and said, "The defence rests," without bothering to ask Shaw any further questions on redirect. That almost never happens. After a defendant is cross-examined, the defendant's lawyer generally needs to ask some redirect questions to repair the damage that's been done on cross-examination, but Alcock's cross-examination hadn't done any damage to Clay Shaw, so there was no need to repair it. As Patricia Lambert puts it in False Witness, James Alcock didn't lay a glove on Shaw. He didn't even seem to try. So why was it that Alcock didn't try? That would be a mystery if we didn't already know that Alcock privately believed Clay Shaw to be innocent. As I explained in the previous episode, Alcock was horrified when Garrison announced very shortly before the trial began that he wouldn't be handling the prosecution himself and that he would instead be handing the poisoned chalice to James Alcock. The night before the trial got underway, Alcock had broken down at the home of a friend, and he said that he didn't know what to do. He said that he was being forced to prosecute an innocent man. Alcock had run the prosecution pretty diligently up to this point, but apparently he drew the line at trying to rip the innocent man a new one on the witness stand. Another surprising thing about Alcock's cross-examination of Shaw had to do with the CIA. In the run-up to the trial, Garrison had made all sorts of wild public claims about the CIA's involvement in the assassination. He had kept going on TV and saying things like this.
I am trying to tell you that there is no question as a result of our investigation that an element of the Central Intelligence Agency of our country killed John Kennedy and that the present administration is concealing the facts. There is no question about it at all.
That is your opinion?
No, it is not. I know it, and if you will just wait, you will see that history will support this as fact.
That's Garrison speaking in January 1968, a year before the trial. It was now a year later, and people were finally getting to see whether history would support Garrison's hysterical public pronouncements about the CIA, and it was clear that history was not going to support him. When James Alcock cross-examined Clay Shaw, he didn't ask him a single question about the CIA or his supposed connections with it. In fact, nobody on the prosecution side mentioned the CIA at all during the whole course of the trial, not even once. That was a pretty glaring omission given all the claims that Garrison had made about the CIA in public. Here he is riffing about this theme again in 1967.
Well, first of all, Oswald was not part of the plot. Secondly, he did not fire a shot at anyone, not only on that day. He never fired a shot in the preceding year or in the preceding 2 years or since he got out of the Marines, as far as anyone knows. A number of the individuals who accomplished the shooting were previously connected with the Central Intelligence Agency, many of them connected in their training in Florida. And those are some of the individuals whose names we have, and I judge by now they know we have their names. The thing which seemed to have bothered the United States and caused a major world power to participate in such a lowly fraud, such an indescribably low fraud, was the fear that the reputation of the United States or the Central Intelligence Agency would somehow be damaged when it came out that former CIA employees were involved in the assassination and that individuals with control over Oswald, CIA employees, were involved, and that Oswald was working for the CIA. So the United States government participated in one of the greatest lies in history in order to save its face.
Again and again, Garrison had made huge public claims like that about the CIA's involvement in the assassination. But at the trial, the subject of the CIA seemed to slip the prosecution's mind entirely. The one solitary mention of the CIA at the trial came from Shaw's own lawyer. Irvin Diamond asked Shaw on the stand, "Have you ever worked for the Central Intelligence Agency?" And Shaw replied, "No, I have not." So what was going on with all these strange aspects of the prosecution's case? The strange forgetting of the CIA angle, the strange meekness of James Alcock's cross-examination of Shaw, and the strange fact that Garrison didn't run the prosecution himself and barely even bothered to turn up in court. Vincent Bugliosi suggests that all these strange things had one underlying cause. In Bugliosi's opinion, when you put all these things together, they added up to proof that Jim Garrison knew full well that Clay Shaw was not guilty and that Garrison had committed what Bugliosi calls the unpardonable sin of knowingly prosecuting an innocent man, partly for his own personal glory and partly because he needed a convenient stick to beat the Warren report with. That's why the prosecution didn't have any stomach for putting the boot into Clay Shaw personally when he appeared on the witness stand. Their true beef wasn't with Shaw, it was with the dreaded official story about the assassination. Irvin Diamond made this same point when he stood up to deliver the defence's closing argument. He said that Clay Shaw was nothing but a patsy. He said the only reason that Shaw had been put on trial was to, quote, create a forum for the presentation of this attack upon the Warren Commission. But as Diamond reminded the jury, it wasn't the Warren Commission that was sitting in the dock. It was his client, Clay Shaw. Diamond urged the jury to reject the prosecution's illogical attempt to make Clay Shaw pay for the supposed sins of the Warren Commission. He said, quote, "It doesn't matter whether there was one man shooting at Kennedy in Dealey Plaza or 10, because no case of conspiracy has been made out against this defendant. Don't let the horror of this awful deed that was committed in Dallas cause you to convict an innocent man just to try to balance the scales." Diamond's final appeal to the jury was eloquent, but it was the state that had the burden of proof, so it was the state that would get to deliver the final word. And that final word was going to be delivered by none other than Jim Garrison himself. It was 11 o'clock at night on that final day of the trial when Garrison appeared in court to deliver the state's closing argument. His speech was not long, it only lasted for 25 minutes. And again, what was remarkable about Garrison's speech was not all the things that he did say, but all the things that he didn't say. In the course of his 25-minute speech, he mentioned Clay Shaw's name only once. This speech was meant to be Garrison's big final chance to tell the jury why it should find the accused man guilty, and yet he could hardly bring himself to utter the accused man's name. His only mention of Shaw came when he told the jury, quote, "You are sitting here in judgment of Clay Shaw," which was a pretty meaningless statement, given that the jury already knew that it was sitting there in judgment of Clay Shaw. The question at hand now was why exactly they should find Shaw guilty. After all, wasn't that meant to be the point of the whole exercise? Wasn't that why Garrison had so dramatically arrested and charged Shaw 2 years earlier, so that he could eventually get a guilty verdict against him in court? If that wasn't the point, then why was Clay Shaw sitting here? Why had he been put through this whole ordeal? Garrison was the one who had made all this happen, and yet in his closing argument he didn't even make a token effort to convince the jury that Clay Shaw personally was guilty of anything. He didn't mention any of the witnesses who had testified against Shaw specifically. He didn't mention Perry Russo, or Vernon Bundy, or Charles Speasel, or James Hardiman. Instead, he talked about Dallas, he talked about Dealey Plaza, and he talked about the Grassy Knoll witnesses and the Zapruder film, which he mentioned 5 times. He talked about big abstract themes like power and justice. He talked about the Warren Commission. He talked about the, quote, important and powerful and politically astute men who had sat on that commission, and he said that their whitewashing of Kennedy's assassination was, quote, the greatest fraud in the history of our country. It was probably the greatest fraud ever perpetrated in the history of humankind. And Garrison told the jury that it now had the power to undo this gigantic fraud. He said, you represent, in a sense, the hope of humanity against government power. As a closer, Garrison quoted John F. Kennedy's, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And Garrison said to the jury, what can you do for your country? You can cause justice to happen for the first time in this matter. You can help make our country better by showing that this is still a government of the people. And if you do that, as long as you live, nothing you do will ever be as important. This was all classic Garrison. He claimed to be deeply in favour of this abstract thing he called justice, but when it came to the non-abstract, real-life question that he was supposed to be talking about, the guilt or innocence of Clay Shaw, Garrison seemed to think that justice didn't matter or that it could somehow be bypassed. In fact, he was fairly openly asking the jury to perpetrate a rank injustice. He was saying to them, I can barely be bothered to mention the defendant's name, let alone suggest to you that he personally is guilty of anything, but I want you to find him guilty anyway, so that you or we can undo the greatest fraud ever perpetrated in the history of humankind. Apart from being breathtakingly cynical, Garrison's final pitch was a serious confession of failure. The prosecution had failed to show that Shaw was guilty of anything. Garrison did seem to be dimly aware of that, but what he didn't seem to be aware of was that the prosecution had also failed to show that there had been any wider conspiracy or cover-up. He spoke very confidently about the immense government fraud that existed in his head, but his chance to prove that this fraud existed outside his head in the real world had come and gone, and he'd completely blown it. This was quite a failure, given all the wild promises that Garrison had made before the trial about the sensational proof of conspiracy that he would be providing when the time came. Here's a little reminder of the kind of promise that Garrison made on TV when the trial still lay some distance in the future.
If I knew the names of the individuals behind the grassy knoll, where we know they were, and the stone wall, I certainly would not tell you and couldn't hear. There is no question about the fact they were there. There's no question in our minds what the dominant race of these individuals was, and there's no question about the motive. In the course of time, we will have the names of every one of them.
Well, the course of time had been run now. The trial was over, and the prosecution hadn't named any of the names that Garrison had so confidently promised to name. The only names the prosecution had named were the 2 names that Garrison had been trotting out since the very beginning, David Ferry and Clay Shaw. And in his closing argument, Garrison failed or forgot to mention Ferry's name at all, and he only mentioned Shaw's name once. The time had finally come for Garrison to put up or shut up, and although he hadn't exactly shut up, he certainly hadn't put up either. He hadn't put anything on the table because he didn't have anything to put on the table. All those swarthy men on the grassy knoll who he promised to name didn't exist outside his own imagination. When Garrison's closing speech was done, it was time for the jury to start deliberating. They must have known from the start that they were not going to take very long, because by the time Garrison's speech was done, it was almost midnight. The jury could have retired for the night and come back on Monday morning to begin its deliberations, but instead it opted to begin those deliberations that very night. And as we know, the jury only wound up taking 54 minutes to reach its not guilty verdict. One of the jurors said later that they would have been even quicker than that, but first they all needed to line up and take a piss before they started deliberating. When the verdict was delivered, it was 1:04 in the morning on March the 1st, 1969, which meant that it was now exactly 2 years to the day since Clay Shaw had been arrested. After the verdict, Shaw went over to the jury box and he shook each juror by the hand. Garrison typically was not there to hear the verdict. He later claimed that he was at home when the verdict was delivered and that he was informed of it by telephone. It later emerged that the jury didn't reach its not guilty verdict unanimously on the first vote. One juror voted guilty on their first ballot, but it didn't take long for the other jurors to talk him around. When he was interviewed later, the juror who had voted guilty said that it was the testimony of Garrison's so-called Clinton witnesses that had persuaded him to believe, at least briefly, that Shaw was guilty. I said in the previous episode of the podcast that I would come back to the Clinton story when I was done telling the chronological story of the trial itself. So now that we're done with that main story, let's circle back to the story of the Clinton witnesses. The Clinton witnesses testified on the first day of the trial. They were the first witnesses that the prosecution put on the stand, and they got the prosecution's case off to a flying start. They testified that one day in the summer of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald had turned up in the small town of Clinton, Louisiana, in a black Cadillac driven by Clay Shaw. The story told by the Clinton witnesses later turned out not to be true, but explaining how we know that it isn't true is a story in itself. That's why I put the story to one side when I was telling the story of the trial itself. It's hard enough to tell the story of what did happen in the Shaw case and in the Kennedy case more generally without having to stop every 2 minutes to talk about things that didn't happen. But that is what conspiracy theory always wants you to do, of course. It's always trying to sidetrack us. It's always throwing myths at us and challenging us to disprove those myths, and so that our ability to move forward and understand what did happen and add that understanding to our knowledge of reality is permanently crippled and compromised. But now that I've finished telling the story of what did happen at the Shaw trial, we do need to come back to the Clinton story, because this is, after all, a podcast about Kennedy conspiracy theory. It's a podcast about those myths that sprang up like weeds after Kennedy's assassination. Those myths have done a lot of harm in the real world. They've destroyed people's lives, and they've helped to degrade America's political discourse to the point where a depraved old Garrison-like conspiracy theorist like Donald Trump can become the leader of a major political party. So we do have to linger over some of those myths in detail, and we have to work out exactly how they arose, and we have to try to understand why some of them have had such a long half-life. The story told by the Clinton witnesses had the longest half-life of any of the myths that came out of the Shaw trial. Garrison threw a lot of garbage at the wall during the 2 years when he was investigating the Kennedy case, and he hoped that at least some of that garbage would stick to the wall for a while, at least for long enough for him to get a conviction against Shaw. Some of Garrison's garbage slid off the wall so fast that even Garrison had stopped believing in it by the time the trial started. But the Clinton story stuck to the wall for decades, In 1994, 25 years after the trial, Shaw's attorney Irvin Diamond admitted that he still hadn't worked out the truth behind the Clinton episode. He told Gerald Posner, the author of the book Case Closed, that the story was, quote, a pack of lies. What the motive of the Clinton witnesses is, I do not know, but it is clearly and demonstrably false. It wasn't until the year 2000, 6 years after Irving Diamond said that the truth about the Clinton episode was finally established. And when it was, it became clear that it wasn't quite right to say that the Clinton story was a pack of lies. The story the Clinton witnesses told certainly hadn't been true, but it also wasn't true that they had been lying. Indeed, the idea that they were simply lying had never been all that likely. There were 8 Clinton witnesses in total, and the idea that Garrison had been able to persuade 8 people to all lie about the same incident had always seemed improbable. That's what had made the Clinton evidence so impressive in the first place. Garrison was certainly no stranger to rustling up individual liars who told lies on the stand about one-off scenes or incidents that only they claimed to have witnessed. This is witnesses like Russo, Bundy, Hardiman and Spiesel. But to get 8 different people to lie about the same story would have been quite an achievement even for Jim Garrison. And in fact, there did turn out to be a tiny but important element of truth in the story the Clinton witnesses told. This often turns out to be the case with conspiracy theories. When you clear away the smog and the smoke, you quite often find that there's an ember down there of something that really did happen, even if that something has been misremembered or reimagined or distorted almost beyond recognition. To tell the story of the Clinton episode properly, I first need to make it clear that the episode we're talking about was actually 2 episodes which took place, or supposedly took place, in 2 small towns in Louisiana, the town of Clinton and the nearby town of Jackson. When people talk about the Clinton evidence, they're often using Clinton as a kind of shorthand for the evidence about both Jackson and Clinton. I was myself talking in shorthand a couple of minutes ago when I said that there were 8 Clinton witnesses at the trial. The more accurate way of putting it was that there were 4 witnesses from the town of Jackson and 4 witnesses from the town of Clinton, who testified about a series of events that took place in both towns over the course of 2 separate days. Although no 2 of those witnesses told exactly the same story, when you put their stories together, you got the following basic narrative. One day in August or September of 1963, a beaten-up old car had driven into the town of Jackson, Louisiana, which is located about a 2-hour drive northwest of New Orleans. A man got out of this car and went over to get a haircut at the local barber's. At the trial, the barber who cut this man's hair positively identified the man as Lee Harvey Oswald. The barber said that a woman, presumably Marina, had come along with Oswald in the car too. There was a bassinet in the back seat, which presumably contained a baby, and while Oswald came in to get his hair cut, Marina stayed in the car with the baby. While Oswald was getting the haircut, he told the barber that he was interested in applying for a job at the local state hospital. The barber suggested that Oswald should talk to the local state representative about this. The barber happened to be a friend of the state representative, so he gave Oswald directions to his house. The state representative appeared on the witness stand next, and he testified that Oswald had paid him a visit later that same evening. He recalled telling Oswald that his chances of getting a job at the hospital might be enhanced if he registered to vote in the area. The story now cuts to the town of Clinton. It's several days later, and there's a voter registration drive taking place in town, which has been organised by the Congress of Racial Equality. Clinton was a small town with a population of only around 1,500 people, and this voter registration drive was quite a big event. A large crowd of mostly black citizens had turned up to register, and a long queue had formed in front of the registrar's office. This queue was very slow moving. It would have taken about 5 hours to get from the back of the line to the front. At around 10 in the morning, a black Cadillac pulled up in the main street of Clinton. 3 or possibly 4 white men were in the car. The driver was a tall, grey-haired man who several witnesses agreed looked like Clay Shaw. One of the passengers was a man who several witnesses agreed was Lee Harvey Oswald, and some witnesses identified a third man in the car as David Ferry. Oswald got out of the car and walked over to join the voter registration queue. At several points over the next few hours, the man who looked like Clay Shaw was seen standing with Oswald or near him in the queue. Because almost everybody else in the queue was black, Oswald and his white friends stood out like sore thumbs, and the incident seemed to have lingered in the witnesses' minds, even 6 years after the event. Oswald waited on the registration line for about 5 hours, and when he finally got to the front, the registrar told him that A, he didn't need to register to vote in order to get a job at the state hospital, and B, he wasn't eligible to register anyway. So Oswald said thank you and left, which doesn't sound very much like Oswald. Still, the Clinton witnesses did seem generally credible, and 2 of them were high-ranking public officials. One of them was the Registrar of Voters himself, and the other was the town marshal. So the Clinton evidence did seem quite formidable, and you can see why Garrison's office led with that evidence and why one of Garrison's deputies had confidently predicted that, quote, "Just wait till the first day. It's going to be all over on the first day." Even at the time, though, there were a couple of things about the Clinton story that were highly suspect. Neither Oswald nor his wife Marina could drive, and they didn't own a car, and presumably their baby couldn't drive either. So the idea that the 3 of them had been able to rustle up a car and drive together to Jackson was pretty unlikely. Also, if Clay Shaw and David Ferry were planning to double-cross Oswald and use him as their fall guy, then it's hard to see why they would have wanted to hang around with him as conspicuously as this in a public place in front of so many witnesses just 1 or 2 months before the assassination. And why, in any case, would Oswald have needed 2 or possibly 3 wingmen to accompany him when he was doing something so trivial as just registering to vote? Also, it seemed odd that none of Garrison's 8 witnesses had ever come forward to report these alleged Oswald sightings before. If they'd really seen Lee Harvey Oswald in the company of several strange men just before the assassination, why hadn't they told the FBI that straight after the assassination in 1963? Failing that, why hadn't they told the Warren Commission in 1964? Why had they waited until 1967 or 1968 to tell their stories to Jim Garrison? And as for the respectability of the Clinton witnesses, it quickly turned out that 2 of them, the town marshal and the registrar of voters, were not quite as upstanding as they seemed. In February 1969, while Shaw's trial was still in progress, the FBI reported that both these men were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Indeed, the Registrar of Voters was the exalted Cyclops of the local chapter, which is apparently quite a big deal for a Klansman. So right from the start, there were good reasons to believe that the Clinton evidence was quite fishy. But despite that fishiness, the story made quite an impact at the trial, and it hung around in the conspiratorial atmosphere for a long time afterwards. The Clinton scenario was Jim Garrison's greatest hit. It had the longest shelf life of any of the junk evidence that he presented at Shaw's trial. Long after all of the other evidence presented by Garrison had melted away into nothingness, the Clinton story lingered. It became a highly useful piece of scrap material for other later conspiracy theorists to use for their own purposes. They salvaged it from the junkyard of Garrison's investigation, and they refurbished it and inserted it into their own preferred narratives. Oliver Stone put a Clinton scene into his movie JFK, with Gary Oldman as Oswald and Tommy Lee Jones as Clay Shaw hanging around in the dusty main street of Clinton and generally making a spectacle of themselves. And in 1991, more than 20 years after the Shaw trial, the author Anthony Summers still thought highly enough of the Clinton evidence to use it in his popular non-fiction book about the case, Conspiracy. Anthony Summers is by no means a lightweight writer. He's probably the most astute of all the conspiratorial writers about the case, and his book has been called the definitive work about the assassination. It's been published in many different editions over the years, and my copy of the 1991 edition has got enthusiastic blurbs on it from heavyweight people like Norman Mailer and Don DeLillo and Arthur Schlesinger. In that 1991 edition of the book, Anthony Summers makes it quite clear that he was not in general a fan of Jim Garrison's work. He writes, quote, "His probe has long been recognised by virtually everyone, including serious scholars who believe there was a conspiracy, as a grotesque, misdirected shambles. What angers investigators most about Garrison," says Summers, "is that his cockeyed caper in 1967 was more than an abuse of the justice system, it was an abuse of history, and more than any other single factor, it discredited and stalled genuine research for a full decade." And yet, despite saying all of that, Summers also says that Garrison's investigation, quote, "did, however, bring forth some vital nuggets of good evidence." That sounded like a fairly risky claim for Summers to make, given his awareness that Garrison's investigation was in general a grotesque shambles and an abuse of history. Certainly Summers was raising an interesting general question. That question is, can an investigator who was as generally unscrupulous and shameless as Jim Garrison nevertheless discover some things that turn out to be true and reliable? My answer to that question would be no. When you're dealing with a rank conspiracy theorist like Garrison, a man with a proven track record of making shit up, you simply have to assume that everything he says is bullshit. Even if you can't prove straight away that it's bullshit, it will always turn out to be bullshit in the end. You just have to give it time. But Summers, in that 1991 edition of his book, didn't think that. He said that Garrison's generally grotesque investigation did bring forth some nuggets of good evidence, and the most important of those nuggets, according to Summers, was the story of Oswald's visit to Clinton. After discussing the Clinton evidence for 2 pages, Summers concludes that, quote, "it now seems highly likely that Lee Oswald was in the Clinton area and spent some time preparing the ground for his bid to register as a voter." Summers, though, doesn't have any time for the idea that the man with silver hair who drove Oswald to town in the Cadillac that day was Clay Shaw. Instead, he suggests that the man at the wheel was Guy Bannister, the gung-ho right-wing anti-communist and ex-FBI man who was played by Ed Asner in the JFK movie, even though he looked more like Lee J. Cobb. According to Summers, the long-term impression left by the Clinton evidence is of an Oswald being manipulated by forces representing the precise opposite of his public political posture. So you can see here how Jim Garrison's Clinton story became a useful piece of bric-a-brac for later conspiratorial writers. They tweaked and reshaped his story for their own purposes, and they made it a component of the particular myths that they wanted to purvey. Garrison had used the Clinton story as a stick to beat Clay Shaw with, But Anthony Summers had no interest in the Clay Shaw angle. He was savvy enough to see that Garrison had been completely wrong about Shaw. What did interest Summers a lot, though, was the Guy Bannister angle. So he repurposed the Clinton story to fit that angle. The way Summers retells the Clinton story, the guy who drove Oswald to Clinton in a Cadillac wasn't Clay Shaw, but was far more likely to have been Guy Bannister. Somehow, Summers has a knack of sounding rational when he says things like that, but when you think about it, Summers' take on the Clinton evidence is even less realistic than Jim Garrison's. At least Garrison was able to produce 4 witnesses who testified under oath that the man they saw with Oswald that day was Clay Shaw. Summers decided that those witnesses were correct about the Oswald part, but were wrong about the Shaw part. That was already a bit arbitrary of him, but it was even more arbitrary of him to decide that the man with Oswald, who was not Clay Shaw, was nevertheless not a complete nobody either, but was in fact another leading player in JFK mythology, namely Guy Bannister. This strikes me as a pretty hilarious leap of logic. It's like if 4 of your friends swore to you that they saw George Thorogood in the local supermarket 4 years ago. The likeliest explanation is that they're pulling your leg, or that they saw a non-famous person who looked a bit like George Thorogood. The hypothesis that they really did see Thorogood is far less likely, although it's not entirely out of the question. But if you hypothesise that the man they saw was in fact Iggy Pop, you're not taking the conversation in a particularly helpful or useful or realistic direction. Anyway, 2 of the Clinton witnesses at the Shaw trial were explicitly asked if the man they saw with Oswald was Guy Bannister, and they both said no. In fact, the registrar of voters actually knew Guy Bannister personally because he'd served with him during World War II. And when the prosecution asked him if Bannister was the man he saw that day with Oswald, he nixed the idea. He said, "I'm sure that I would have known Mr. Bannister if I had seen him." I've said that Anthony Summers is probably the best of the conspiratorial authors about the Kennedy case, and I stand by that. I still think that he is. But the way he handled the Clinton evidence in that 1991 edition of his book shows us that even at its best, conspiracy theory is still conspiracy theory. It's written by people who want to make and preserve myths rather than kill them off. It's written by people who are into wishful thinking and ignoring inconvenient evidence and clinging on to junk evidence when it can be used to serve their purposes. It's only fair to add, though, that Anthony Summers did subsequently have a big change of heart about the Clinton evidence. In 2013, he published a revised edition of his book, this time under the new title, Not in Your Lifetime. This time around, Summers had cut the 2-page discussion of the Clinton evidence from the text. He explained why in an endnote, which said, quote, "The author included the Clinton episode in earlier editions of this book. However, research published in a 2000 book by author Patricia Lambert effectively demolishes the Clinton story. It is therefore not given any space in the text of this edition. The author suggests that interested readers refer to Lambert's book False Witness." End quote. If I wanted to be a dick, I would say that the things that Patricia Lambert discovered in the year 2000, which demolished the Clinton story, could easily have been discovered earlier by Summers himself or by other writers like him, if they'd been inclined to revisit the Clinton evidence in a critical way. But they had no incentive to do that because they were writing books that were designed to promote and preserve the idea of a Kennedy conspiracy. It wasn't until Patricia Lambert came along and wrote a diligent but unsexy book about the truth behind the Shaw trial that the Clinton myth was finally thrown into the dustbin of history where it belongs. So how did Patricia Lambert pieced together the true story behind the Clinton evidence. Well, she paid a visit to Clinton when she was researching her book, and while she was there, she met a local woman named Anne Dishler who had helped out with Garrison's investigation in 1967. Garrison had assigned the Clinton angle to an investigator named Francis Fruget, and when Fruget went out to Clinton, he employed Anne Dishler as his local sidekick and researcher. When Patricia Lambert spoke to Dishler in the mid-1990s, Dishler was still loyal to Jim Garrison. She still believed that he was a decent guy who had conducted a good faith investigation. But despite her naivety, Mrs. Dishler was also an honest and decent person, and she answered all of Patricia Lambert's questions honestly. She'd also kept her written notes that she'd made when she was investigating the case, and she let Lambert read over those notes. And as Lambert listened to Anne Dishler's recollections and read over her notes, she quickly realised that Dishler unwittingly held the key to the whole Clinton mystery. The first interesting thing that Lambert discovered when she was speaking with Anne Dishler had to do with the timing of her investigations in Clinton. Garrison's office put Fruget and Dishler onto the Clinton angle in May 1967. The timing of this move was suggestive. Clay Shaw's preliminary hearing had taken place 2 months earlier, in March, and Shaw had been committed to stand trial at the end of that proceedings. Ever since then, though, things had been going badly pear-shaped for Garrison's investigation. James Phelan's devastating exposé about the hypnotising of Perry Rousseau had appeared in the Saturday Evening Post on May the 6th, and at around the same time, Dean Andrews had finally made it crystal clear that he was never going to change his mind and testify against Shaw. So Garrison was fast running out of credible or even semi-credible witnesses who he could use at the trial, and he needed to find some new ones pretty urgently. So that was the context in which Garrison assigned Francis Fruget and Anne Dishler to look into the Clinton angle. But what was it that made Garrison know or think that there was a Clinton angle to start with? That question had always been a bit of a mystery. It was clear enough that somebody must have tipped Garrison off about the Clinton story, but the identity of that original tipster had never been known. Garrison himself had been coy about how he'd been put onto the Clinton story. He said that he'd been led to it by a, quote, whisper in the air. But when Patricia Lambert dug into Anne Dishler's notes, she found out who the original tipster had been. It was none other than Henry Earl Palmer, the exalted Cyclops of the Clinton clan. This meant that there was something more than a bit circular about the Clinton evidence. Henry Earl Palmer was one of 4 witnesses who got up on the stand and confirmed the Clinton story for Garrison at the trial, but the story he was confirming had come from him in the first place. That didn't necessarily mean that the story was untrue. After all, there were other witnesses who confirmed it on the stand as well, but it did suddenly make the Clinton story seem far less impressive. One of the strengths of the Clinton story is that it sounds so random that you tend to think it must be true. Why would anybody say that they saw Lee Harvey Oswald in Clinton, Louisiana, of all places, registering to vote, of all things, unless that story was true? Who on earth would make such a story up? Well, if there was one person in the world who was the likeliest to have made that story up, it was the Registrar of Voters in Clinton, Louisiana. Maybe this Henry Earl Palmer guy was another Louisiana bullshit artist like Jack Martin or Dean Andrews, another guy who wanted to believe that the assassination had something to do with him personally, and who wanted to give himself a little walk-on part in the crime of the century. Still, there were other witnesses who backed up the registrar's story, as I've said. But when Anne Dishler was talking to Patricia Lambert, she innocently mentioned something that put a huge cloud over the testimony of those other witnesses. She mentioned that When she and Francis Fruget were pounding the pavement in Clinton in 1967, trying to rustle up other local witnesses for Garrison, Fruget had a 3x5-inch black and white photograph with him, which had been supplied to him by Garrison's office. This photograph appeared to have been taken in Clinton on the day when Lee Harvey Oswald and Clay Shaw came to town. It showed a black Cadillac parked in the main street, opposite the registrar's office. 4 men were sitting in that car, and even after 30 years, Ann Dishler still remembered the details of the photograph fairly clearly. She told Lambert, quote, "Clay Shaw was in the driver's seat. It looked like him to me. I remember the white-haired man in the picture and the small face of Oswald. It seems like Oswald was on the passenger side of the car, but I'm not sure. And it seems like I remember a darkened area in the back of the car where Ferry and Bannister were supposed to have been." When Ann Dishler mentioned this photograph to Patricia Lambert, she didn't think that she was divulging anything all that important, but Lambert saw straight away that what Dishler was saying was explosive. Obviously, there was no way in the world that Garrison's office was ever in possession of an authentic photograph that showed Oswald and Shaw sitting together in a car. Garrison had never publicly mentioned the existence of this photograph, and if he'd had it, he would have triumphantly produced it at Shaw's trial, and Shaw would have been toast. The obvious inference is that the photograph was a fake, which Garrison's office had fabricated to help potential witnesses in Clinton remember, or think that they remembered, having seen Oswald and Shaw in town together. The photograph would have planted a false image in their memory banks, so that when they got up on the witness stand and testified that they'd seen the 2 men come to town in a black car, they would be testifying to something that, in their minds, they believed to be true because they'd seen photographic evidence of it. And if Garrison's office had gone to the trouble of fabricating a photograph of Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald, that in turn suggested that Garrison knew more or less from the start that the Clinton story wasn't true. People who believe that something's true and who've got good evidence to back up that belief don't tend to go around fabricating evidence to support it. And Garrison's office did have a track record of doing things like this. It was in the habit of deceiving potential witnesses by assuring them that they were only confirming things that Garrison already had good, solid evidence for. For example, when Garrison's deputies drove Perry Rousseau to Clay Shaw's house so that Rousseau could positively identify Shaw as the man he'd known as Clay or Clem Bertrand, Rousseau was told that his IDing of Shaw would be nothing but a formality. "We're probably not even going to use you in the courtroom," he was told. But just a few days later, Rousseau discovered to his horror that he was going to be used in the courtroom and that he was Garrison's star witness against Shaw and in fact pretty much his only witness. When Rousseau found that out, he said, "My God, don't tell me that they've arrested that man on what I said." If Garrison's office was unethical enough to tell verbal lies to witnesses like Rousseau, it had already crossed the Rubicon. And so what was to stop it from deceiving other witnesses by showing them forged and fabricated pieces of physical evidence? And there is evidence that Garrison used forged documents on other occasions. Back in episode 13 of the podcast, I briefly mentioned a guy named Gordon Novell. He was a security expert who briefly worked on Garrison's team during the David Ferry phase of the investigation. Novell quit from Garrison's team in February 1967 because he was appalled by some of the tactics that he'd seen Garrison use. And when Novell spilled the beans about what he'd seen, one of the things he said was that he'd seen forged letters lying around Garrison's office, including letters which had purportedly been written to David Ferry by Lee Harvey Oswald. Again, the obvious inference is that Garrison had forged these letters so that he could show them to potential witnesses to persuade those witnesses that if they got on the stand and said that they had seen Oswald and Ferry together, that would be a harmless lie because it would only be confirming an association that really did exist. As if the story of the fake photograph wasn't enough, Patricia Lambert discovered another anomaly in the evidence as she read through Ann Dishler's notes. And when Lambert pulled on this particular loose thread, she ended up unravelling the whole Clinton mystery. The loose thread had to do with a Clinton witness named Corey Collins. When Collins testified at Shaw's trial, he said that he recalled seeing all three key players in Garrison's conspiracy, that is Shaw, Oswald and Ferry. He recalled seeing all three of them in Clinton on the day of the voter registration drive. That made Corey Collins the strongest of Garrison's Clinton witnesses. All four of the Clinton witnesses had positively identified Clay Shaw as the driver of the black Cadillac. 3 of the 4 had positively identified Oswald as one of the passengers, and 2 of the 4 said that they had seen David Ferry. But Collins was the only witness who positively identified all 3 of those men as having been there. That's what he said at the trial anyway. But according to Ann Dishler's notes, Collins had said something completely different when she'd interviewed him for the first time. He'd told her that he only saw 2 men arrive in the black car that day. Both of them were white men. They both got out of the car and joined the voter registration queue. One of the men was dressed in white, and Collins told Dishler that he'd never seen this man before and had no idea who he was. He did, however, recognise the other man. He said that he was a local man whose name he didn't know, but whose last name he thought might be Morgan. The name Morgan rang a bell for Patricia Lambert because she remembered that name had come up at Clay Shaw's trial. One of the other Clinton witnesses, the voting registrar Henry Palmer, had testified that when he saw Oswald in the voting line that day, Oswald was standing with or near a local man whom Palmer knew, a man named Estes Morgan. To Patricia Lambert, it seemed pretty obvious that Estes Morgan was the same man that Corey Collins had mentioned in his initial interview, the man whose last name he thought might be Morgan, who got out of the black car that day and walked over to join the registration queue. So Patricia Lambert was really starting to get to the bottom of things now. She could see that there was some kernel of truth in the Clinton story. There really had been an incident when 2 white men came to town in a black car and lined up in the voter registration queue. One of those men was apparently a local man named Estes Morgan. But who was the other man, the stranger dressed in white? In his initial interview with Ann Dishler, Corey Collins said that he'd never seen this man before and couldn't identify him. He didn't say anything about him being Lee Harvey Oswald. But if this second man wasn't Oswald, then who was he? As she read deeper into Dishler's notes, Patricia Lambert discovered that back in 1967, Dishler had succeeded in working out who this second man was. He was a friend of Estes Morgan's named Winslow Foster. Foster worked at the state hospital, which would explain why he'd come to town dressed all in white. So to sum up, when Ann Dishler checked out the Clinton lead for Jim Garrison in 1967, she'd discovered that it was a complete non-starter. It didn't have anything to do with Clay Shaw, Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, Guy Bannister, or the Kennedy assassination. Yes, it was true that one day in August or September of 1963, 2 white men had shown up in the main street of Clinton in a black car, and they'd got out of the car and joined the voter registration queue. But mind you, neither of those men, Estes Morgan and Winslow Foster, looked anything like either Oswald or Clay Shaw or David Ferry. Estes Morgan was 56 years old in 1963. He was 6 feet tall with dark hair, and in photographs he looked a bit like Gregory Peck. Winslow Foster, meanwhile, was 48 years old, 5'11", a bit husky, and had sandy hair and a fair complexion. But they were both white, and they had both lined up in the voter registration queue on a day when almost all the other people in the line were black, So you can see why this incident would have lingered in some people's minds, at least at a vague subconscious level. By the time Patricia Lambert visited the town of Clinton in the mid-1990s, both Estes Morgan and Winslow Foster were dead, so she was unable to confirm the truth about the Clinton episode from either of the horses' mouths, but she was able to track down Estes Morgan's widow, who confirmed that the story that Dishler had pieced together in 1967 was basically correct. According to his widow, Estes Morgan had indeed tried to get a job at the state hospital in 1963. He had gone to the local state representative for help, and the state representative had suggested that he should enrol to vote in Clinton to boost his chances of getting the job. So he and his friend Winslow Foster had driven to Clinton one day in August or September, and they'd lined up together to vote. Anne Dishler worked most of that out back in 1967, but when she conveyed her discoveries to Garrison's office, guess what Jim Garrison did? He didn't admit that the Clinton angle was dead, and he didn't shut down his investigation of it. Instead, he simply took Anne Dishler off the case and assigned it to one of his assistant DAs instead. And lo and behold, when Garrison's deputy took over the investigation, the story of the Clinton witnesses dramatically changed. They suddenly started to remember that 4 white men had come to town that day, not 2, and that one of those men was Oswald, and one of them was Shaw, and one of them was maybe David Ferry. No doubt the fake photograph helped them to remember that, and maybe there were other methods of coercion and cajoling used as well. We don't know exactly how Garrison got the Clinton witnesses to change their stories. All we know for sure is that their stories did change, and they changed in a way that was very helpful to Garrison. 2 white men in a black car became 4 white men in a black car. A 56-year-old guy with dark hair who looked like Gregory Peck became the silver-haired Clay Shaw. A 48-year-old husky guy with sandy hair became the 22-year-old dark-haired, non-husky Oswald. There was a dimly remembered real incident at the bottom of the Clinton story, and with the help of some sharp practice from Garrison's office, Garrison's conspiratorial fantasies were successfully superimposed on top of that dimly remembered real incident. By the time the Clinton witnesses got up on the stand 5 years after the event and testified that they saw Oswald and Shaw come to town that day, most of them probably didn't even realise that they were lying. As I've said, a lot of successful conspiracy theories are like this. They're rarely based on nothing at all. They always tend to contain some barely recognisable nub of real historical truth. But that nub of truth will be something that doesn't mean anything significant by itself. To become significant, it has to be refracted and distorted by the funhouse mirror of the conspiratorial imagination, which can bend totally meaningless facts into all sorts of darkly significant shapes. And the scary thing about this particular myth, the Clinton myth, is how easy it was for Garrison to get it off the ground and how hard it was to debunk it once it was in play. To get the myth going, all Garrison had to do was be willing to be radically dishonest and unethical. And once the myth was out there in the atmosphere, it stayed out there for more than 30 years. In fact, it would probably still be in the atmosphere today if one lone author, Patricia Lambert, hadn't gone to Clinton to revisit the myth with a sceptical eye. Thankfully, the Shaw jury was not swayed by the Clinton evidence. One juror initially voted guilty because of it, but apparently it wasn't hard for the other jurors to change that guy's mind. The members of the Shaw jury were not idiots, even though Garrison's office seemed to be gambling that they were. On the trial's final day, one of Garrison's investigators predicted that the, quote, boobs in the jury box would be too dumb to remember anything about the trial apart from Garrison's closing statement. But the jurors turned out to have a far firmer grasp on reality than Jim Garrison himself did. One of the jurors said after the trial, after it was all over, it was like, wow, what happened? What, that's it? Another juror said, it was difficult to determine who was on trial, Shaw, the Warren Report, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the Secret Service. The day after the Shaw verdict was handed down, Jim Garrison was savagely denounced by the American press. The New York Times called the Shaw trial one of the most disgraceful chapters in the history of American jurisprudence. Even the New Orleans papers, which had been on Garrison's side before the trial and during the trial, turned against him when the trial was done. One of the local papers ran an anti-Garrison editorial on its front page under the headline, "Garrison should resign." This travesty of justice is a reproach to the conscience of all good men, the editorial said. Garrison stands revealed for what he is, a man without principle who would pervert the legal process to his own ends. Needless to say, Jim Garrison didn't resign. Far from it. On Monday, March the 3rd, the next business day after the not guilty verdict came down, Garrison responded by doing something that was truly out there, even by his standards. He charged Clay Shaw with perjury. During the trial, Shaw had testified that he had never met either Oswald or Ferry. In Garrison's mind, that was a lie. So, after failing to convict Shaw of conspiracy, Garrison promptly charged him with perjury. This was a staggering thing for a DA to do. Again, it's worth hearing what Vincent Bugliosi says about this, given that Bugliosi worked as a prosecutor himself. Bugliosi writes, "It's extremely rare, almost unheard of, for a defendant after his criminal trial to be prosecuted for committing perjury in his defence, whether or not he was convicted of the offence for which he was on trial. It's just not done, even when there is no doubt in the DA's mind that the defendant committed perjury." But of course, Jim Garrison specialised in doing things that just weren't done. Privately, he explained that if he put Clay Shaw on trial for perjury, that would make people forget the conspiracy trial, and that if he could get a perjury conviction against Shaw, that would have the same effect as having convicted him of conspiracy. In one sense, that was literally true, because if Shaw was found guilty of perjury, he would face a maximum prison sentence of 20 years in prison, which is the same maximum sentence that he would have faced if he was found guilty of conspiracy. So the unfortunate Clay Shaw didn't get much of a chance to celebrate his victory over Garrison. Less than 48 hours after being found not guilty on the conspiracy charge, he found himself back in legal hell. Again, he faced the prospect of going to prison for 20 years, with no telling when the case against him would finally come to trial. Shaw wrote in his diary that the situation had become Kafkaesque, and his second legal ordeal would end up lasting almost exactly as long as the first one had. It wasn't until January 1971, nearly 2 years after Garrison laid the perjury charges, that Shaw's second trial was finally scheduled to begin. But on the very day the trial was meant to start, Shaw and his attorneys successfully applied for a restraining order that stopped the prosecution from going ahead. Shaw's lawyers charged that Garrison's prosecution was illegal and unconstitutional, and that he was acting in bad faith and abusing the powers of his office. The restraining order they got was only temporary. It would now be up to a federal judge to decide whether or not the perjury charges were unconstitutional. The judge who heard this case was a guy named Herbert Christenberry, and the Christenberry hearing would end up being a disaster for Jim Garrison, and it would finally drive a stake into the heart of his crazed 4-year vendetta against Clay Shaw. The hearing went for 3 days. Shaw's attorneys called 17 witnesses to appear at it, including James Alcock, Jim Garrison, and Clay Shaw himself. Garrison's team called no witnesses, possibly because now that they were no longer operating on their own turf, they feared that the judge might lay perjury charges of his own against any witness who lied on the stand. As one of Shaw's lawyers put it, they couldn't find anyone who wasn't afraid to lie. When Clay Shaw testified at the hearing, he was asked to explain how Garrison's harassment of him had affected his life and his liberty and his ability to pursue happiness. Shaw said, "Well, it's been a very agonising 3.5 years. When you are charged with having committed the most heinous crime, I suppose, that you could be charged with, your life habits suddenly become a lot more restricted. You find yourself being, I guess you would say, hated, shunned, avoided, and just generally your life becomes a great deal more miserable as you try to live with something like that." When James Alcock got on the witness stand, he testified that he could think of no other case in which Garrison's office had filed perjury charges against a defendant who had been acquitted. When Garrison himself got on the stand, he said some things that were truly weird. When he was asked why he'd first begun to suspect that Clay Shaw was involved in Kennedy's murder, Garrison testified that he had interviewed Clay Shaw 3 times, and only after the second interview had he begun to suspect him. There was something about his answers which did not completely correspond and did not completely fit, Garrison said, and it was after that he became a suspect. Garrison was seriously rewriting history with that one. The record showed that he'd interviewed Shaw only once before arresting him. That interview had taken place a good 2 months before the arrest, and it hadn't aroused any suspicions in Garrison at all. In fact, Shaw had made such a good impression on Garrison at that interview that Garrison told his staff to forget about Shaw because he'd obviously had nothing to do with the assassination. It was only when David Ferry dropped dead 2 months later and Garrison urgently needed to find himself a new prime suspect that his attention suddenly pivoted back to Clay Shaw. He then promptly arrested Shaw without interviewing him for a second time, let alone a third. Only after arresting him did Garrison interview Shaw for a second time. That was just one of several major brain explosions that Garrison had on the stand at the Christenbury hearing. At another point, he testified that when Clay Shaw was indicted, David Ferry was still alive. That was so flagrantly untrue that Shaw's lawyer did a double take. "David Ferry was alive when Shaw was indicted," he said. And Garrison replied, "As a matter of fact, he was not only alive, but we were considering indicting him shortly before his death, and this followed Shaw, so he would have been alive." Garrison had always played fast and loose with the facts, but now he was doing it on a witness stand under oath. The record said that David Ferry had died on February the 22nd, 1967, and that Clay Shaw was arrested a week later, on March the 1st, and that he wasn't indicted until March the 22nd, exactly a month after Ferry's death. So what was going on in Garrison's mind when he jumbled up the facts like this? As usual, it's easy enough to say that there was something wrong with his mind, but it's much harder to say exactly what it was. Patricia Lambert writes that Garrison's testimony was, quote, "so demonstrably untrue that the natural assumption is that Garrison was merely mistaken. But something more complex seems to have been going on here. Garrison's mind appeared to be rearranging reality to suit his needs at any given moment. The remarkable number and nature of Garrison's mistakes that day gave rise to thoughts about neurological disorders or deep-seated psychological pathology." Whatever Garrison's exact neurological problem was, Judge Christenbury was distinctly unimpressed by his testimony. Christenbury ruled that Garrison's perjury charges against Shaw were indeed unconstitutional, and he issued a permanent injunction against any further prosecution of Shaw by Garrison. In his written ruling, Christenberg really went to town on Garrison. He wrote that his conduct had been appalling, outrageous, and inexcusable. Garrison undertook his baseless investigation, he wrote, with the specific intent to deprive Shaw of his rights under the 1st, 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. So now it really was all over for Jim Garrison. His name was mud, at least among people who were capable of recognising and remembering facts. In 1970, Garrison narrowly escaped prosecution himself after he was accused of fondling the genitals of a 13-year-old boy in a health club. The case went away only because the boy and his family decided that it was too much trouble to pursue it. In 1973, Garrison was prosecuted on charges of taking $147,000 worth of bribes from illegal gambling operators. He was acquitted of those charges, but later that same year he was defeated in the Democratic primary for DA. The man who beat him was Harry Connick Sr., whose son Harry Connick Jr. would later become a famous New Orleans musician. Connick Sr. said that the Shaw case was, quote, absolutely the most terrible, gross and abominable prosecution that he personally had ever seen. Garrison went to extremes to prosecute an innocent man, he said. In 1978, Jim Garrison was elected to serve as a judge on the Louisiana State Court of Appeals. In 1988, he published his fantastically dishonest book On the Trail of the Assassins, which a few years later became the basis of Oliver Stone's fantastically dishonest film, JFK. Garrison himself made a cameo appearance in that film, playing Earl Warren, the chair of the Warren Commission. Oliver Stone seemed to think that he was making some kind of deliciously ironic point when he cast the ageing pop-eyed charlatan Garrison to play the extremely decent and upstanding Earl Warren. But the irony was entirely at Oliver Stone's own expense, not anybody else's, because any person who believes that Jim Garrison was a towering American hero and that Earl Warren was a great American villain is more than just a moral idiot. He's perceiving reality in an exactly upside-down way. But that kind of moral upside-downness has become Oliver Stone's trademark as a filmmaker. After making a cinematic hero out of Garrison in JFK, Stone gradually drifted out of the feature film business, and he wound up making a series of low-budget, bootlickingly sympathetic documentaries about some of the world's most criminal dictators and thugs, including Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Viktor Yanukovych, and Vladimir Putin. After crossing the moral Rubicon in JFK, Oliver Stone just never came back. He'd managed to convince himself that Jim Garrison was a great humanitarian and hero, and after doing that, it apparently wasn't much of a stretch to believe that Vladimir Putin was one too. As for Garrison himself, he died in 1992 at the age of 70, just a year after the release of JFK. Sadly, the success of that film let Garrison go out on an undeserved high. Kevin Costner had played Garrison on the screen as if he was the nicer twin brother of Jesus Christ, instead of what he really was, one of the most unscrupulous and reprehensible lying shags in American history. For 6 episodes now, we've been circling around the issue of Garrison's mental health. Something was clearly wrong with him, but what exactly was it? When he was medically discharged from the army in 1951, the psychiatric report said that he had, quote, a severe and disabling psychoneurosis of long duration which had interfered with his social and professional adjustment and which would require a long-term psychotherapeutic approach, end quote. After the Shaw trial, an attorney who knew Garrison and had worked with him in the DA's office, a guy named Milton Brenner, wrote a book called The Garrison Case, a study in the abuse of power. And here's how Brenner summed up Garrison's handling of the Shaw case in that book. Quote, "Surely, said many in New Orleans, Garrison must have something. A man in his position would be stupid indeed to make such public statements without some solid evidence, and Garrison certainly was not stupid. Overlooked by many was the clear possibility that the man was stark raving mad." If I wanted to deliver my own final word on Garrison's mental health, I wouldn't put it quite so crudely as to say that he was stark raving mad. I've spent a fair bit of time in these episodes trying to argue that things were not quite as simple as that. But then again, Milton Brenner knew Garrison and worked with him, and I certainly can't claim to have done that. So if Brenner was ready to say in print that Garrison was stark raving mad, then I don't think I'm in any position to disagree with him. All that I would add is that just because Garrison was crazy, that doesn't preclude the possibility that he was also an evil piece of shit. He wasn't so insane that he didn't know the difference between right and wrong. He did know the difference, but he consistently chose to do the wicked thing. He may well have been genuinely delusional, but he was also a deliberate and chronic liar. He was both mad and bad. But why did Garrison fixate on Clay Shaw to be the focal point of his raving Kennedy obsession? Was it just because Shaw was gay, or was there something more to it? Clay Shaw had his own theory about this. According to Shaw, the whole thing might well have gone back to a primal scene in a New Orleans restaurant. Jim Garrison was well known for abusing his wife in public, and one night in a restaurant called Brennan's, Garrison made an atrocious scene by getting progressively drunk over dinner and berating his wife at the top of his voice, and finally throwing a glass of wine in her face. Clay Shaw was sitting at an adjacent table, and he saw the whole thing. And as Garrison stormed out of the restaurant, he went past Shaw's table and he saw him watching. Later on, when Garrison's persecution of Shaw was in full swing, Shaw told some of his friends that he suspected that this incident in the restaurant might lie at the bottom of the whole crazy thing. As we wrap up this discussion of the Shaw case, I also want to say a final word about Clay Shaw and the CIA. After Shaw died in 1974, the CIA released a report which revealed that Shaw had in fact had some dealings with the agency. During the Cold War, Americans who made professional or business trips behind the Iron Curtain were routinely interviewed and debriefed by the CIA's Domestic Contact Service when they got back to America. Clay Shaw had made business trips to East Germany and Czechoslovakia in the late 1940s and early 50s, and he'd also visited some countries in Latin America. And when he returned home from those trips, the Domestic Contact Service had debriefed him. The last time this happened to Shaw was in 1956. This was all entirely a matter of routine, and it certainly doesn't mean that Shaw was an employee of the CIA or that he was a CIA agent or operative. During that Cold War period, a total of around 150,000 American journalists and business people were debriefed by the CIA in this way, and Shaw was just one of them. That was the extent of his proven connection with the CIA. You do sometimes hear people say that it's well known that Shaw worked for the CIA. That isn't true, and it certainly isn't true in the way that conspiracy theorists want it to be true. But as is so often the case with conspiracy theory, there is a tiny nub of misinterpreted fact behind the distortion. But the last word in this story really has to go to Clay Shaw himself, the cultured and dignified man who was at the centre of this incredible freak show that Jim Garrison put on in New Orleans. This whole story really has been like a circus in many ways, with Garrison as the depraved Willy Wonka-like ringmaster, and an almost endless succession of liars and nutcases pouring out of his clown car, from Jack Martin to Dean Andrews to Perry Russo to Charles Speisel to the exalted Cyclops of the Clinton clan. But at the centre of this freak show, Clay Shaw seemed like a character from a different genre. He was a literate and intelligent grown-up, a playwright, a restorer of historical buildings, a man who was having a pretty good and productive and successful life until Jim Garrison blundered in and destroyed it. What he did to Clay Shaw is a travesty of justice, said Shaw's lawyer, Irvin Diamond. The abuse of power from a megalomaniac prosecutor destroyed Shaw's life. It was one of the low points in the history of our judicial system, and I don't know how Garrison can hold his head up without shame. I've relied a lot on Patricia Lambert's excellent book, False Witness, in these episodes, and in that book Lambert writes very sensitively about Clay Shaw, and she's particularly good on the way that Shaw managed to keep his emotions in check during that period, and how his grace under pressure made him a very difficult person to understand and relate to. Lambert writes, "Throughout those terrible years, he was awesomely dignified and stoic, almost saintly. He behaved so splendidly that it was difficult to connect with him. Had he openly displayed just a bit of anger or the anguish he poured into his journal, he would have seemed less distant and opaque." End quote. In fact, Shaw was so saintly that even in the privacy of his own journal, he couldn't bring himself to express hatred for Jim Garrison. He wrote in his journal that Garrison was, quote, "a big shambling behemoth driven by the lust for power and attention." Shaw knew that he was more than entitled to hate Garrison, given the facts, but try as I would, he wrote, I could only feel that this poor son of a bitch needs help far worse than I do. In February 1970, when Garrison's perjury charges were still hanging over his head, Clay Shaw and his lawyers filed a $5 million lawsuit against Garrison and several other parties who had played questionable roles in the conspiracy prosecution, including Perry Russo and the hypnotist Dr. Esmond Fatter. Their suit charged that Garrison had, quote, misused and abused the prosecutorial powers vested in him, and that his prosecution of Shaw was an unlawful one undertaken in bad faith for the purposes of harassment and served no legitimate interest of the state of Louisiana. Sadly, Clay Shaw became terminally ill with lung cancer before his lawsuit could be resolved. He died in August 1974, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. At the time of his death, Shaw's opponents were preparing to offer him a six-figure out-of-court settlement to end the lawsuit. But when Shaw died, it became legally unclear whether his lawsuit could continue or not. That became a matter for the courts. Several lower court judges ruled that the suit was still valid, but in March 1978, 3.5 years after Shaw's death, the Supreme Court overturned those verdicts and ruled that because Shaw had no surviving relatives, his lawsuit was now defunct. As the New York Times reported at the time, Mr. Shaw, a homosexual whom many think was selected because of his vulnerabilities, left no survivors. The sad result is that Mr. Garrison will not be brought to judgment for prosecutorial abuses that injured the reputation of an innocent man for a petty purpose, to build a conspiracy theory and discredit the Warren Commission. Patricia Lambert calls Shaw a tragic but remote figure frozen in time. End quote. But although Shaw's fate was tragic, the tragedy that he fell victim to was not a natural disaster. or an act of God. It was inflicted on him by human beings who were driven by very bad ideas. This is the reason why I've dwelt on this case for so long, because I view it as a cautionary tale about the human costs of conspiracy theory. It shows us what happens when the bad ideas of conspiracy theory are literally believed in and put into practice and allowed to run riot. We should never forget that what got Jim Garrison interested in the Kennedy case in the first place was his reading of the early conspiratorial books like Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment and Edward Epstein's Inquest. When Epstein first met Garrison over dinner in New Orleans, Garrison had a copy of Harold Weisberg's book Whitewash with him, and he kept leafing through the book as they spoke. Of course, conspiracy theorists themselves reject the idea that they were responsible in any way for the excesses of Jim Garrison. They view him as a charlatan who abused their cause and brought disgrace on it. And I do think that we can applaud the efforts of those conspiracy theorists who said this about Garrison at the time when his prosecution of Clay Shaw was still happening and when there was still some chance to make it stop. Edward Epstein did that when he published a scathing New Yorker profile of Garrison and then expanded that article into a book called Counterplot. Sylvia Meagher also tried to blow the whistle on Garrison well before the trial began. Harold Weisberg broke with Garrison more quietly after an incident when he saw Garrison simply make up a piece of evidence. Weisberg didn't blow the whistle on that incident at the time. He left it till much later to denounce Garrison. Somewhere down the road, he lost contact with reality, Weisberg said. I just don't understand what he was up to. There was just no evidence of Shaw's guilt. Unfortunately, though, a large part of the reason why Garrison lost contact with reality is that the books of people like Harold Weisberg helped him to lose contact with reality. Weisberg himself had called the Warren Report a national disgrace, a monstrous evasion, and a blot on the national honour that had to be rectified. Surely Garrison had done no more than take Weisberg at his word and use his prosecutorial powers to try to rectify the monstrous but imaginary evasions of the Warren Commission. Garrison once provided a blurb for a reprint of Mark Lane's book Rush to Judgment, and here's what Garrison's blurb said. All America is indebted to Mark Lane. He held the door open until the rest of us decided to examine the case critically. End quote. I could hardly have put it better myself. Jim Garrison walked through a door that had been held open for him by Mark Lane and people like him. And when you walked through any door that was held open by a person like Mark Lane, you were bound to be entering a world of radical dishonesty and nihilism, and nothing that followed could possibly be any good. In fact, Mark Lane did far more than just hold the door open for Jim Garrison. Lane went down to New Orleans and eagerly went through the door with Garrison. Lane had a hands-on role in Garrison's investigation from the very beginning to the very end. He was present in Garrison's office on the night of Clay Shaw's arrest, and unlike all the other famous Kennedy conspiracy theorists, Lane stuck with Garrison right to the ugly and shameful end. When the jury came back with its not guilty verdict, Mark Lane was there in the courtroom. He was seen slinking out shortly afterwards, looking gloomy. In the next episode of the podcast, we're going to follow Mark Lane out of that courtroom. We're done now with the story of the Shaw trial and Jim Garrison, but unfortunately the story of the Shaw trial did not spell the end for Kennedy conspiracy theory or for American conspiracy theory in general. It should have. The movement should have died of shame in New Orleans, and at the very least it should have taken a good hard look at itself. But people like Mark Lane never take good hard looks at themselves. They never give up. They just move on. conspiracy theory never dies, it just mutates and attaches itself to new causes. In the 1970s, Mark Lane was like the Zelig of American conspiracy theory. Wherever there was a criminal or a charlatan who was in need of conspiracy theory, Lane always seemed to end up in the picture somewhere. In 1977, he wrote a conspiratorial book about the murder of Martin Luther King. Lane claimed that James Earl Ray, the convicted assassin of King, was innocent and that he'd been set up by the FBI. Lane visited James Earl Ray in prison and promised to get him out if Ray agreed to appoint him as his attorney. Lane did succeed in becoming James Earl Ray's attorney, but he didn't succeed in getting him out of prison. But his efforts did win the approval of at least one distant admirer. Down in Guyana, in Jonestown, the Reverend Jim Jones was becoming a big fan of Mark Lane's. One of Jones's favourite films was Executive Action, a thriller which was based on a screenplay co-written by Mark Lane. The film was about a fictional American president getting murdered by a conspiracy of rogue government agents. Jim Jones invited Mark Lane to Jonestown and he asked him if he would be interested in writing a similar feature film about the government's persecution of him. Lane had a better idea. Maybe Jones should engage him as his attorney for a fee of $20,000 so that Lane could set about finding proof of the vast CIA and FBI conspiracy against Jim Jones. Jones liked that idea a lot, and Lane became his chief legal wingman. Lane was in Jonestown on the night in 1979 when Jim Jones murdered 900 of his followers. Lane was detained at gunpoint by a couple of Jones's lackeys, and he fled into the jungle before he could become part of the death toll himself. There's a line that runs from Dallas through New Orleans down to Jonestown, and if you follow that line even further, you can see that the style of thought that linked Mark Lane and Jim Garrison and Jim Jones is alive and well today in the bloated Garrison-like figure of Donald Trump. And we'll be talking more about those connections next time on The Ghosts of Dallas.
On the question of debate, now let's go into that. On the question of debate. For almost 3 years I've traveled up and down this country. I was here before at UCLA. I've been at 85 other college campuses. Where were the commission lawyers?
We're here now, Mr. Lane.
Just hold on.
We're here now.
I'm right here. Mr. Liebler, let's
You've declined my invitation to debate.
Let's play a game called courtesy. You be quiet when I speak and I'll be quiet when you speak.